What is happening, Legion fans? James Hancock here, back to review episode 7 of season 2, aka chapter 15. After last week's episode, which felt a little bit like a 7th inning stretch, I have to say I absolutely loved tonight's episode, but I will say this, the comments that I received on last week's review were far more insightful and far more perceptive than any notes I had to offer on that particular episode. As I saw tonight, my read on the previous episode was totally off base, so I just wanted to pause and say thanks to everybody who offered such careful observations on last week's episode. I did see a little bit of bad news, though, that last week's episode apparently so far only had about 350,000 viewers. I know the way like Nielsen ratings these days are a little bit off. I'm never quite sure how they track people watching episodes on demand, or perhaps they record them and save them for later, but the number was the second lowest recorded for the series since its inception. If memory serves correctly, during season 1, the average viewer was around 950,000 per episode. So if things don't pick up, sadly, we might see yet another show that I love on the chopping block. For those of you out there following Expanse, obviously Expanse got canceled last week. So let's all rally the troops and get behind Legion just in case Noah Hawley wishes to do a season 3. I haven't seen anything by Noah Hawley to confirm or deny whether or not he wishes to do a season 3, but I want him to at least have that option if he has more story to tell. But what I really loved about this episode was that it brought back some of John Hamm's narration. I just absolutely adore these little short films that he narrates, and tonight's little short film was all about moral panic, and it demonstrated how when there is a perceived threat to standards of society, that we can often behave in very irrational, hateful, terrifying ways. They gave us a glimpse into the moral panic that faced the comic book industry back in the 50s. And for people who don't know, people went basically completely fucking bonkers in the 1950s, terrified that comic books were somehow going to convince children to go out and commit mass murder. While comic book historians today might look back on an issue like Crime Suspense Stories number 22 with a gorgeous cover by Johnny Craig, and they view it as one of the high watermarks of horror comics in the 1950s. But 60 years ago, it resulted in congressional hearings and all these ridiculous books being written about the influence of comics on children, and the result was a lot of censorship for the next couple of decades. But I like how John Hamm posed the question, what is more terrifying? The emotion of fear or confronting a group of very frightened people? And what was particularly interesting about this little segment was that it ties into the conclusion of the episode as well. But like many episodes so far in this show, this episode gave us an absolutely gorgeous title sequence. We see Amal Farouk working on his car, and he's basically souping up this luxury vehicle with all this purple goo. But as we're seeing this beautiful title sequence, David calls him out over the death of Amy. They basically meet in this little library, and David tells him that henceforth he will not be helping him anymore, and that when he finds Farouk's body, he's going to burn it. But Farouk, who's rapidly becoming one of my favorite villains on TV, calls out David for his hypocrisy and says that David basically hated Amy for locking him up, and that it's time to make the world pay and for David to show his true face. Gods do not follow rules, they make them. But when he concludes that David is not necessarily ready to be a member of the big boys, he quite literally sends David back to the kiddie table. And after a very frightening confrontation with Amy, who's just laughing in a very eerie fashion in his face, David wakes up in the tank. But another thing that was really fun about this episode was how it showed how even when you're dealing with insanely powerful mutants, that little things like jealousy can still enter into one's relationships. David and Sid are having a conversation about future Sid, and when David gives a few dodgy answers to her questions, she immediately gets suspicious. Are you getting physical? Like, do we need to have ground rules? And obviously, there's no roadmap for dealing with this kind of scenario when you're having an ongoing series of conversations with the future self of your current girlfriend. But what's really interesting is how Farouk basically takes the chessboard that he and David are currently playing and throws it out the window and smashes all the pieces because he travels into the future to confront future Sid herself and asks her point blank why she wants him alive, and she spills the beans that she desperately needs Farouk to be alive in the future because, as it turns out, when it comes to heroes and villains, it's a little murkier in the future, and that she needs Farouk to save the world from David. Farouk keeps slipping with his terminology because he keeps talking about ruling the world versus saving it, but when it comes to existential threats for the entire planet, obviously our traditional notions of black and white morality start to fall to pieces. Between the choice of two evils, perhaps Farouk's not such a bad guy after all. But future Sid gets one more visit from David, and he tells her that he's not going to be helping Farouk anymore, that he can't get over the fact that Farouk murdered his sister Amy. And then future Sid basically shows why younger Sid has a reason to be jealous, because future Sid does try to put the moves on David, and when they kiss, there's a little bit of tongue. I mean, Once again, we're in very strange, unknown territory here. But the rest of the episode gets really weird in a good way. For people who've been craving a little bit of action, we get an absolute truckload. And we finally get a little bit of payoff from some of the seeds that have been planted for the last few episodes, where we kept seeing references to this horrible, disgusting little parasitic creature that crawled into the ear of Ptonomy. And he basically makes up his mind that Fukuyama and his little army of mouthpieces have become a threat. So Ptonomy joins up with Clark, Sid, and Carrie, and they basically go to war with Fukuyama for a bit. Ptonomy and Carrie are taking on this enormous army of regenerating and replicating robots. And when Clark and Sid confront Fukuyama, they see that he's an old Asian man who has this kind of mount on his head with all these bolts and screws kind of holding his neck and skull together. I assumed that whoever Fukuyama was going to be someone who's recognizable, but I guess we'll have to wait and learn more about Fukuyama in the episodes to come. Or at least I didn't recognize Fukuyama. Did anybody else recognize Fukuyama out there? But as it turns out, Fukuyama is being wrongfully suspected of wrongdoing, and David arrives to save the day and sees that these little parasites are hovering inside the heads of all of his friends. So David starts plucking these creatures out and stepping on them when Ptonomy, his body just completely rips to pieces and this giant, enormous monster rips out of him. David chases it down and basically yanks the creature into the astral plane, and when the creature assaults him, he shrinks it down to a very manageable size, puts it in a glass jar, and just pops it. And here's where we return to the lesson that John Hamm offered in the beginning when he's talking about how when our beliefs are threatened, our ideas can become irrational, and while delusions might start out as an egg, these eggs can become a monster. And that was perfectly visually represented in the episode when David sees a hallway with all these cracked eggshells. But my question for everybody else out there is this just a situation where all the central characters kind of embraced a collective insanity for a bit? Or is this another weapon by the Shadow King trying to undermine our characters at Division 3? It seems to me as if it's totally, completely out of left field if this delusion monster happened in total isolation, if it doesn't have some sort of connection to the larger story. But if there is a connection that's been underlined, I either failed to perceive it or it hasn't been articulated yet, so help me out on this front. So sadly, Ptonomy, he dies, but Fukuyama is able to save his mind by plugging him into the mainframe, and then we get this additional mystery at the end where Ptonomy's inside the mainframe trying to get adjusted, and he finds an old woman in there who looks at him and just gives him a little signal. Who she might be, I have no idea, but obviously I'm intensely curious. So this episode was pretty damn cool. Had a ton of action. It answered a few questions, it introduced a few new mysteries, and it had a very overt, interesting reference to 1950s comics. So for me as a viewer, it had a lot for me to sink my teeth into. I know a lot of people loved and adored last week's episode, but tonight's episode was definitely way more my speed. In any case, I think I'm going to wrap this video up, but the teaser for next week's episode looks pretty interesting. It looks as if David and Sid are finally going after the Shadow King's body, but for very different reasons. Something tells me that David and Sid might have some giant confrontation before the season's over, resulting in her missing arm that we see in the future. All we really know about the final couple episodes is that it's going to end with basically David taking on the future. At least that's what it said in the press release a couple weeks back. All I can say for certain is that for the next 4 weeks, I will definitely be tuning into Legion, because if this is in fact the end of this story, I want to savor it while it lasts. But I hope you enjoyed my reaction, review, and recap. Please consider giving my channel a subscribe if you want to hear more rants of a similar nature. I'll definitely be tackling The Expanse and its cancellation tomorrow evening after tomorrow night's episode. And I'll definitely be tackling Deadpool 2 on Thursday, a movie that I'm beyond fired up to see. But if you want to talk more, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax, or just leave a comment in the comments below. But I hope everyone has an amazing week. And as always, onwards and upwards.